Morning all, I'd like to show you the complete set of 4 games between Robert James Fischer and Paul Keres in the Bled Zagreb Belgrade Candidates Tournament of 1959. In round 8, Fischer had a disastrous game against Paul Keres in the variation of the Caro-Kann 2 Knights. Now in round 22, on the 18th of October 1959, Fischer was again white against Paul Keres. As a quick reminder, Paul Keres, born 1916, died 1975, was an Estonian chess grandmaster and a renowned chess writer. He was among the world's top players from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s. He narrowly missed a chance at the World Championship match on 5 occasions. He won the 1938 Avro tournament, which led to negotiations for a title match against champion Alexander Alekhine, but the match never took place due to World War II. After the war, Keres was runner-up in the Candidates Tournament on 4 consecutive occasions. Due to these and other strong results, many historians consider Keres the strongest player never to have become world champion. He was nicknamed Paul II, the Eternal Second, and the Crown Prince of Chess. He was the only player in history to have defeated 9 undisputed world champions. So here we have now the round 22 encounter. Fischer persisted with e4, of course, and after c6, would he have something different prepared in this line of the Caro-Kann, which many of the Russian players in this tournament had started adopting, where previously they had never played the opening at all. Fischer, by this time, by the way, was a 2 times US Championship winner. He was one of the strongest grandmasters in the world at the age of just 16. So he did actually play in this position the move knight c3. So not playing d4, not going into what we consider mainline Caro-Kann territory, but instead this, after d5, he actually dared repeat the 2 knights variation. He played knight f3, and again we got a repeat of bishop g4. So black's strategy here, voluntarily often giving up this light square bishop, is often pursuing a dark square strategy, and often black's knights can be quite good on the dark squares as a result. So here Fischer kicks the bishop, encouraging it to exchange on f3, queen takes f3 and a repeat of knight f6, d3, e6. This was becoming a very familiar position for Fischer in this tournament with the white pieces. g3, it echoes the King's Indian defence in reverse. If white can get in bishop g2, move the queen and play for f4, kind of a King's Indian attack type system. But black now plays this very annoying move, bishop b4. In fact, in later games, there's a game example after this tournament where Fischer actually played a3. He took time to play a3 to stop this annoying pin. On live book, for those interested, a3 is quite let's see how rare this move a3 is in this position. It's actually quite a popular move in this position. g3 is actually much rarer than playing a3, so perhaps if you want to make this system more viable, maybe we can learn that a3 is better. But also bishop d2 here is an often played move. So bishop d2 or a3. So in this game we see g3 though, allowing this bishop b4. Bishop d2 here, and now we see black repeating d4, and after knight b1, Petrosian's choice twice in this tournament was taking on d2, which he got a draw and a win against Fischer. But this other move, queen b6, has a lot going for it. Fischer repeated b3, which does weaken some dark squares, and this knight's left with a problematic development here. Knight bd7 is now played. This looks like an alternative to the earlier game if a5 was played there immediately, but if that's the case, now we see a5 anyway, and in this position a3, and here actually instead of the retreat bishop e7, we see Paul Keres just taking on d2 here now. So a bit of variance, taking on d2 here, which seems to allow at least the knight not to be tortured as much as their earlier encounter. The knight is now free to potentially come to c4. But we see now the move queen c5. Let's just check some variations here. If white could potentially castle. Losing the c2 pawn is not, I guess it's absolutely not desirable, or maybe it's okay. This is what I want to check out. Queen takes c2, knight c4. This might be about equal apparently. This is not so clear. The queen's kind of trapped there. So perhaps this is actually playable in this position to castle. In fact, it's actually given us one of the engine's top moves. That, and Fischer's move slightly less. Fischer's move here is actually to do something about the c2 pawn. He does retreat the queen humbly back just to d1, and now we get an aggressive positional move in that this bishop has often been targeted by the Russians in this variation to make it dead ineffectual. Try and close it in with its own pawns, lock it in with e5, and Petrosian in an earlier round has clamped down on f4 with g5. But here we see black playing h5. So the idea to try and play h4 to get more pawns on light squares on the same colour as white's bishop, and then black could really dance around on the dark squares, both g5 and e5 potentially. If a lock is placed on f4, you can imagine fantastic knights on the dark squares at some point. So Fischer is perhaps keen to stop black playing h4. He doesn't really want to play h4 himself. That weakens a lot the g4 square. Black would be clearly better. Perhaps knight g4 might even be playable, knight e5. Then if we have a position like this, this would be absolutely horrendous to play f4. This would be a gaping hole on g4. So h4 is not that desirable. So we see knight f3 here. If white routinely castles, h4 does seem quite attractive just positionally, but maybe white has some resources, but it does look as though black's doing quite well in this kind of position. If white's really forced to play g4, it doesn't look too healthy on the dark square set. This bishop really looks dead. So okay, so we see this, instead of casting, we see knight f3, and unfortunately, okay, it stops h4, but it does invite the annoying queen c3 check. Okay, and perhaps surprisingly, Fischer plays king e2. Let's see, king f1, is that playable? King f1? Perhaps that's slightly worse because the rook can't play rook e1 later, so maybe he wants to keep his rook to be able to play to e1. So it looks a bit odd, king e2, but on the other hand, the queen is not doing that much on c3. The queen goes back actually now, queen c5. We see queen d2. So far, it doesn't look like necessarily a complete disaster like their earlier encounter in this opening. But Paul Keres is keen on getting rid of white's knight here. If this knight can be removed, then we get a more simplified knight versus bishop potentially. So knight e5, and we see now b4, and the queen doesn't have to actually step back here. Paul Keres plays knight takes f3, attacking white's queen in return. So b takes, this wouldn't be, I believe it's not very nice for white, this position. Knight d7, weak pawns, that's not very desirable at all. So bishop takes f3, so we're left with this situation emerging, knight versus bishop here. Queen e5, but black has this dark square grip, which is challenged with queen f4, and we see knight d7, and the queen's come off now, but black is left with this very dominant knight on e5, which clearly white would want to kick away with the move f4 soon. But for a moment there's this question about the tension on the queen side of these two pawns, which is resolved with b takes a5. So Fischer doesn't mind leaving himself with a backward a3 pawn. He's got this b file to play with. We see now Paul Keres connecting rooks quite elegantly with king d7, and the king is able to neutralise the pressure potentially on b file with king c7 at some point. In fact, that's tested now. King c7, rook b4 attacking d4, and in this position the attack on d4 is actually ignored. Black just plays rook takes a5. So what would happen? I guess this is a problem. Let's just check it out. Rook takes d4. The rook is actually terminated with c5 here. This knight is really looking after black on many squares like c4. So that's not possible to take that pawn. So basically it looks as though black here has gathered some significant trump cards. If his d4 pawn isn't weak, it's still marking some dark squares like c3. It's going to be supported with c5. This knight is potentially better than this bishop. The question is about f4. Is that going to be effective or not? Bishop g2, preparing f4. But now, as in the earlier game against Tigre and Petrosian, black is keen on making f4 a less attractive proposition and plays actually the move g5. So this means that if f4 is played now, then black can look forward to using the g file potentially, and also some weak pawns. But if Fischer doesn't play f4, then maybe black's going to be playing g4 here. Let's see. I mean, let's give white a token move. Let's check this out. I'm not sure actually g4 is necessarily the best, but it's a bit committal when maybe it's not needed. Okay, so okay, this just as an example. So white did rush though to play f4 here, kicking the knight, but it does leave now these slightly weakened pawns. So after knight g6, what to do about f4? The king comes in to protect f4 pawn, not minding about knight h4 check here. It doesn't really do that much. But rook g8 now threatens much more power with knight h4 to win a piece. So the bishop drops back. The bishop's not looking too happy in this pawn chain. And the knight now threatens to come into f4 with the move e5. So if f5, then knight f4 looks like a total disaster for white positionally. The knight's pretty dominant on the dark square. Nimzovich would really like this. This position just looks quite dire. In terms of concrete threats, black's actual concrete threat might be h4 and rook g3 check. So this starts to look like a total positional crush to be avoided. On the other hand, after e5, f takes e doesn't look like an attractive proposition either. It gives a mighty knight on e5, unfortunately. But Fischer did play f takes e5. If he tries rook ab1, which is an engine suggestion here, then just b5, black's still better. So Fischer does seem to be positionally being crushed again systematically in this position. So f takes e5, knight takes e5, and here I don't think there's any point in the king coming to f4. In fact, there's a tactical resource. The knight's already protected by the rook, just h4, and black's doing absolutely wonderfully with rook g3 coming up. So the king steps back, and now we see c5 attacking the rook. Rook steps back, and now we see b6. So black here has a classic scenario of the knight being much stronger than the bishop. Simplified endgame type position. White is just absolutely definitely passive. Fischer tries rook ab1, and that pawn is supported, that b6 pawn, with rook g6. h4, which provides a concrete target now. That pawn was protected at least by the bishop on h3. So now with rook a6, black is surely threatening now rook g4, just to torture this pawn. So you might ask, well, did Fischer have to play h4? How would black have made progress if he hadn't played h4? Black is just simply positionally better though. Let's try king d2, maybe rook a8, just doubling rooks, and this will surely get quite unpleasant here. In fact, there's even resources like rook g2 now for knight f3. So this kind of position is just pure torture for white. Black is indeed able to just make significant progress and just snap off this pawn, correct pass pawn, etc. So it's a downward spiral. So we see h4, which really doesn't help white. Potentially, if that is a target for rook g4. So rook a6 and now rook g4 is coming up. But that's interrupted with bishop h3, which does allow rook g3. And now you might think, well, hold on, can white just protect this bishop then with rook h1? Okay, let's just check this out. Rook h1. Unfortunately, black does seem to have the powerful c4 here. So say d takes, rook takes, c takes, rook takes a3, and this is looking horrible, this position. Black's got all the positional trump cards. Rook on the 7th, pass pawn, huge knight. The king has even got an entry on the dark squares here to come into the position. So this is pretty miserable. The bishop just humbly retreats back. And now rook g4. Fischer couldn't have been very pleased with this position. He's dropping h4 now. Bishop h3, rook takes h4, rook h1. Very, very passive. The king can be nicely left on the dark squares, away from the glare tactically of the bishop in any circumstance. Rook a8, rook bb1, rook g8. So black's rooks are having a great time here. Concrete threats emerging like rook g3 here. So we see rook f1, rook g3, bishop gets out of the way. Rook on the 7th is not very nice. King d1. Okay, here the rook, now something has to be done about this rook. Does it want to take on h1? Actually, rook hh2 is played, which seems much stronger actually than taking on h1. If taking on h1, this might give Fischer a little bit more chance, but it's still pretty grim after c4 in any case. This is more accurate, rook hh2. So encouraging Fischer to take on h2, keeping the rook on the 7th, huge knight on e5, c4 as a strategic pawn break. It looks very simple to play, in fact, for black here. Rook g1 and we see c4. So this strategic break means that the knight is potentially gaining access to e3 via the c4 square if white takes, and white did take. So while g4 was not a route, but now knight takes c4 to come to that e3 square, and c2 is being scrutinized now. So rook g7, and Paul uses the sacrifice of a pawn here to get his king very, very aggressively placed with king d6. So after rook takes f7, the knight comes to a very aggressive square, knight e3 check, and here Fischer plays king c1. It looks pretty grim. If he plays king e1, the king can just come in, and this looks as though the king's just heading potentially to mate white if the rook's not standing by on the f file. So with rook e2 coming, that will be a mating net. What would white be able to play here? In fact, the bishop can't move away from the pawn here. Black's got this passed pawn, and black can just take on c2 at leisure. So this is looking absolutely lost, this position. But Fischer played king c1, rook takes c2 check, king b1, rook h2. So again, the king's more aggressive, the knight's more aggressive than the bishop, the rook's on the 7th, and it's cutting white's king, just keeping it on the basement row. Whilst the black king now, after rook d7 check, can make progress. King e5 check, king f4, rook d7. And now, okay, optimistically, Fischer's hoping for king e5 maybe and repeat. Nothing of the sort though. Can you spot the move that Paul Keres played in this position, which sorts out the d pawn, the safety of the d pawn here tactically? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now, black to play in this position, what would you play here? Okay, knight d1. The pawn is immune. If rook takes d4, we would have check, and if king a1 here, then it's rook a2 mate. So if king c1, then there's knight e2 check, winning the rook. So the pawn cannot be taken off the knight d1. Fischer tries king c1, and now we see knight c3. Pawn cannot be taken here because of knight e2, and the king is now coming to that very aggressive square, protecting the pawn, and also then potentially threatening king d3 if white's not careful, the bishop's not on that diagonal for rook c2 mate. So bishop h7, but actually even stronger, king e3 is not even needed here. Black just pushes his passed pawn here with h4, and only after prompting with rook f7 check, now king e3. Okay, and here Fischer resigned. Let's look at an example continuation. In fact, the problem is not actually king d3 and rook c2 here, because the bishop's guarding that diagonal. The problem actually with the king on e3 now is that it's supporting d3, d2. So for example, e5 just stopping d3 anyway. d3, white would have to give up the bishop here. d2 looks really strong, impossible to stop in fact. So the bishop takes d3. This is not good. Piece down for not much. So it was a positional crush again, but for me it showed that even a great legend like Fischer needs good opening positions, and maybe this explains later why in the classic 1972 match against Boris Spassky, Fischer was very keen not to have a targetable opening repertoire. If there's one thing this tournament in 1959 taught Fischer at the age of 16, was that he shouldn't give Russians an advantage out of the opening. And mixing things up in the 1972 match, he played all sorts of openings as black. For example, the Alekhine's defense, even against d4, even played the Benoni, modern Benoni. As white, he didn't even play e4 on a number of occasions. He played c4 with some success. So he really surprised the Russians in 1972. So I think this was a great tournament for Fischer to learn the importance of not being a target in the opening. And this game, this second defeat against Paul Keres in the very same variation as the earlier round, shows great persistence on Fischer's part and will, stubbornness you could call it, but also I believe he must have learnt this lesson about openings, not to give an easy target to the Russians in the opening phase of the game. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.